Okay, so we've looked at what liquidity is, and then we started to look at how, we can identify where we assume resting liquidity is on the chart, or where, liquidity was and has already been swept and taken. Okay, so now we're going to start to get into the more sort of juicy side of things, where we are going to look at, how we actually use these liquidity concepts within our trade plan and how to formulate trade ideas and all that good stuff. So like I was saying before, first we're going to kind of have to strip things down into their individual pieces, into the individual components, so we just know how to identify them and what each individual component, how we interpret it. And then as we go out through the lessons, then we're going to put those all together to put the pieces of the puzzle together right, and we're going to get a bit fancy and then perhaps a little bit lost in the sauce with entry models and all that good stuff. So it's good to just take our time, build things up slowly, and we'll get there. So yeah, and like I kind of touched on there, it can be very easy with all of this, and not just liquidity concepts, but the whole strategy in general. There can be a lot of variables, a lot of components, right? And it can be very lost to kind of, or very easy to get lost in all the source of it. So what I always try and do is trying to bring things back to a high level and ask ourselves is, what are we trying to do here? What is kind of the overarching philosophy of the strategy and the trade plan? And for me, what I think I'm at least doing, or what the philosophy is behind my trading approach, is to look for institutional footprints in the market. Okay, so where was the big money involvement? It's a bit of an oversimplification when I say the big money involvement, but it's just an easy way, I think, to kind of hold on to what it is we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to look for where the big guys got involved. I want to be trading with them rather than against them, quote unquote. So the first kind of way we've been doing that, specifically with sort of looking where they've entered, is looking at supply and demand zones, but not just any supply and demand zone. We want to look for where did big money enter or exit the market to cause those overwhelming imbalances in the market, right? So to significantly move price. How do we do that? Well, we filter those supply and demand zones by looking at ones that either broke structure, right? Because obviously it takes a significant amount of money to break structure. The more significant the structure, the more significant potentially that zone is going to be, or it managed to flip another strong zone, right? Where we see that interaction between supply and demand, and one manages to overpower the other, right? Where one takes control, okay? So when we've been identifying that, that can hopefully signal that there was institutional backing in the creation of that zone, okay? So liquidity concepts, they're simply just another great filter to signal BFI involvement, okay? BFI, banks, financial institutions, right? It's just another acronym in the space that's already overloaded with acronyms, but basically the big guys, right? Institutional involvement is what we're saying there. So it's just another way in which we can now apply these liquidity concepts to what we've already been looking at as another sort of tick in the box. Let's say that potentially there was big money involved in that area, okay? So now just bringing a step back to what we're talking about in the theory lesson, right? Every buy order must have an equivalent sell order for a trade to take place, okay? So obviously, like I said, if you need to buy 10 apples at $2, you need someone selling that minimum amount of apples. Someone needs to be selling at least 10 apples for $2, right? Otherwise, there can be no trade taking place, okay? So if you're a large market participant, right, you're going to need the equal and opposing liquidity to enter the market with minimal slippage, okay? So essentially what that means is, well, if you think about the order book, right, at every single price level, there's going to be, orders, right, supply and demand. And if you're in a market where, say, there isn't a lot of supply and demand and it's a bit of liquid, like you've got loads at list level, not much here, another chunk here, and then loads up here. If you're someone down here, right, and you're a big guy, let's say, and you want to buy 10,000 lots, what's going to happen? It's going to quickly absorb all of that supply, and you're probably going to get filled some of your order up here, okay? So large market participants, they need opposing liquidity to enter the market with minimal slippage, right? If you want to buy here with a ton of volume, you want a ton of volume to be exactly where you want to buy. You want a ton of volume to be selling to you that you can buy from, right? So you can transact at this level rather than getting filled all the way up here. That's essentially it. So when we are identifying where liquidity has already been taken, okay, so that's why we're looking on the price charts and we're going, okay, there was probably, if you got a low like this, right, there was probably liquidity below that low. If we see where price comes down and grabs the liquidity below that low, that's what we say grabs, liquidity has been taken, liquidity has been swept, liquidity has been run. They all essentially mean the same thing, that price has come in and grabbed some of those orders there. So when we say it's been taken in the past, and it leads to the creation of a supply and demand zone. That is what we call a sweep zone, okay? And that's signals where BFIs have likely entered the market, right? And this is where we kind of get some of these patterns like this, okay? So essentially, we are looking for in the creation of, well, let me bring it back again. When we look at supply and demand zone, like I said, right, we're just looking at one structure zones, ones that lead to a break of structure. Now, all we're simply doing is when we identify a zone, we validate it because it did break structure. Okay, so we know it's an institutional zone and is an institutional structure zone. The only extra filter we're now looking for is we look left of the zone and we go, did it sweep any liquidity, right? And it swept the liquidity behind that high. So now we call it a sweep zone, okay? Because if you think about it, if an institution is selling here, right, and they're selling or they're shorting enough, right, to lead price to be able to break a low, that's what we identified, that potentially there was a lot of supply that came into the market, so then we can look to try and get short here, right? So we use the filter of it breaking structure. Now, like I said, for every buy order must have an equivalent sell order, okay? So if you're someone who wants to sell, a ton of volume up here, what do you need? You need someone buying, right, from you selling into. You need a lot of people buying up here. And what do we know about highs? We know there's a lot of buy-side liquidity above highs where people are either buying the breakout of a high or the breakout of a bull flag, or what's the other way? They could be having their stop loss behind the high, right? If they're short and price comes back up, what's their stop loss going to be? It's going to be a buy order, right? If you've sold your position and you're short, if you get stopped out, what do you need to do? You need to buy back your position. So essentially what we know is behind highs, there are tons of buy side liquidity, okay? There's lots of buy orders there. So if you're a big guy and you want to short and you want to sell, what do you need? You need that buy side liquidity. So it's likely you're going to enter short up here, selling into all of that buy side liquidity so you can get as much of your position filled as possible. And then that move leads to an overwhelming imbalance that causes a break of structure, okay? So it's just another filter that potentially signals there was institutional involvement in the creation of this supply zone because it led to a break of structure and it grabbed the liquidity or used the liquidity in order to enter the market, okay? That's the theory behind what we're doing here, okay? So yeah, essentially liquidity, identifying where liquidity has been taken in the creation of a sweep zone, signals where potentially they have likely entered the market, and where liquidity is resting, okay, so liquidity that hasn't yet been tapped into behind here. We'll talk about this later, but essentially that's the concept of inducement, and we can signal where they will likely in the future potentially enter the market, okay? So a sweep zone is a POI that sweeps liquidity as it is created, and we assume that it's likely there was institutional involvement in the creation of the POI as they grabbed the resting liquidity to enter the market, right? So another quick few examples. A point I want to make is how much, I think I alluded to this before, but how much liquidity is behind this high? We never really know, right? But we can look at certain structures and assume that some may have more than others. So if you think about this high here, right? If you've got a bullish market like this, what did this high achieve? It didn't achieve much, right? It didn't break any structure. It's just a weak high that had a pullback. So arguably there's not as much liquidity behind this high compared to what we have over here, right? Because what do we have here? We have price pullback, breaks the high, right? So this low did its job, right? It broke structure. So you could assume that because this low actually achieved something, it broke structure, there should be quite a decent amount of liquidity behind it. So now if price breaks that low there, right? You would assume there's even a ton more liquidity behind here now because it actually achieved, it broke a strong low. So now when price comes back up and sweeps liquidity behind here, the sweep of a strong high, so a high that actually achieved something, compared to the sweep of a high that didn't achieve anything, we can assume there'd be a lot more liquidity building up behind this high. So if you see a zone like this where it sweeps strong structure, strong high or low, right? So you got this low breaks the high, that then becomes a strong low. If price now comes down and grabs the sell side liquidity below that low, we can assume that this, in theory, this zone should be stronger than this zone, right? If everything else was the same, of course you have to bring in market structure, multi-time frame analysis and all that fun stuff. But if you just had two identical zones, but the only difference was this, in theory, this should be the stronger zone because it's used likely more liquidity behind that strong high. And then likewise, same here. If we have a build-up of equal highs, we know there's going to be a lot more liquidity starting to build up behind there compared to if you just had, one weak high like that, okay? And that's pretty much it. You don't need to overcomplicate sweep zones any more than that. Kind of just a little sort of FAQ here. For me, for a sweep zone to be valid, it does not have to sweep strong structure, okay? So that's a weak low, right? If you have a trending market, it never broke the high, so that's a weak low. It doesn't have to sweep it, but this is obviously more ideal, right? Because this sweeps strong structure. So I would view this as higher probability than this, but it doesn't have to be. I would still view that as a sweep zone. Okay, and the other thing is the sweep must be vertically near the POI. So what I mean by that is like if you say you had a pullback like here, and then price comes all the way down, and then price comes all the way up and breaks this high, okay, that is a valid demand zone, right? That broke this high here. But can we say that it swept the liquidity behind this low? Well, it's miles away from me, right? So like, you know, it's probably used liquidity all the way down here. So I wouldn't say that that's a sweep zone of this level, okay? It needs to be pretty near it. Now, the other thing as well that I forgot to mention is sort of when we look at this on the candlestick charts, it'll become a bit more obvious, but sweeps usually kind of, they have what I call the nature of price action. So what you'll typically see is price will kind of come up, it'll sort of be a bit slow, and then it'll kind of just grab the liquidity behind the high, and you'll usually see like a big wick and then like a sharp movement down, okay? It's kind of like slow movement up, and then boom, like the big money steps in. And usually you'll just see kind of like a big wick like that, a big wick retrace, or you maybe see like kind of one or maybe two candles close and then like boom. So it's kind of like that obvious sort of, you know, sweeping nature that you get to it, okay? So yeah, that's it with structural sweep zones, and we'll take a bit of a look at these on